Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have Darra Goldstein with us today for a talk on Ashkenazi Jewish food. This is a part of our Yiddish Civilization 101 series. This is actually YIVO's 101st year as an organization, founded in 1925, to be a kind of Jewish Yiddish Library of Congress in Vilna, Poland, which is now Vilnius, Lithuania. Collecting the everyday stuff of Jewish life, supporting scholarship about Jewish language and culture and history, and teaching the next generation, having exhibitions. And we've been doing this for 101 years now. We shifted our headquarters to New York in 1940. That's a story you can all imagine. So we celebrated our 100th anniversary last year, and as a part of our 101st anniversary, we wanted to touch on some of the really big topics of our world and to give these broad overview introductory lectures to kind of bring people in and situate them into this rich world that we have been doing here at YIVO for 101 years. And so with that introduction, we're just delighted to have Darra Goldstein with us. Darra is the Wilcox B. and Harriet M. Adsit Professor of Russian Emerita at Williams College and founding editor of Gastronomica, the Journal of Food and Culture, which was named the 2012 Publication of the Year by the James Beard Foundation. She has published widely on literature, culture, and art, and cuisine, and consulted for the Council of Europe on using food to promote tolerance and diversity. Goldstein has also authored 5 award-winning cookbooks, including The Georgian Feast, and is the series editor of California Studies in Food and Culture. In 2013, she was named Distinguished Fellow in Food Studies at the Jackman Humanities Institute, University of Toronto, and in 2016 held the McGeorge Fellowship at the University of Melbourne. So, Darra, welcome, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for inviting me to work with you. YIVO is so important as a resource and for helping people understand Jewish life throughout the world. And I'm thrilled that people from all over the world have come here together to watch and listen to this lecture. So, can you all see my screen? I'm hoping that you can, because
yes, looks great.
Okay, good. So I will begin. As I'm sure you probably know, there isn't just one single Jewish cuisine throughout the world. There are so many different iterations, but we can largely divide Jewish food into Ashkenazi and Sephardic. And today we're going to talk about Ashkenazi, which is my own background. And Ashkenazi food has to do with the traditions that came from Jews who fled Europe beginning roughly in the mid-19th century and came to the United States. These foods, as we'll see throughout the course of the lecture, have become iconic not just within Jewish circles, but also in American circles, and particularly in New York City. We have bagels, we have lacto-fermented pickles, particularly the half-sours. We have gefilte fish, and here are some of my own homemade rugelach made from my grandmother's recipe. I want you to just look at the label for this Manischewitz gefilte fish, because a little bit later in the lecture, we're going to see a different label. But this was the one that was touted as the very most premium, the top of the line gefilte fish. So when we talk about Ashkenazi Jews, we're really referring to Jews who lived in the so-called Pale of Settlement, which was part of the Russian Empire. It covered most of present-day Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Moldova. But there are also Ashkenazi Jews who were living in Germany and also what was once the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so Central European Jews, and in Romania. Beginning in about the 13th century, Jews who were considered Ashkenazi in the Germanic lands started migrating east as things got difficult. And by the 18th century, they had moved to Russia. And in the beginning, it was okay. I mean, I can't say that they were exactly loved, but they weren't persecuted. But by the 19th century, it became a lot more difficult. And residence was closed to Jews in most of the major towns of the Russian Empire. As of the mid 19th century, Jews living in Germany and in France and also in some of the Austro-Hungarian lands began emigrating to the United States. And it wasn't until around 1880 that the Jews from the Pale of Settlement came to the United States, and this was a huge wave of immigration, and it continued until about 1924. So life in the old country was not easy. I mean, I came of age or of adolescence, I should say, as a teenager when Fiddler on the Roof came out. And of course, like everyone else, I was so charmed by Zero Mostel and the music and the songs that you couldn't help singing along with. And it was a very bittersweet, but ultimately pretty happy musical. But the reality of life was pretty harsh. And here you see a kitchen, which is actually, the cottage that Jews who weren't too affluent lived in the shtetls, which were actually small towns. And this slide comes from YIVO, which has an amazing archive of all kinds of different materials. So you can see them sitting around the stove. It's a masonry stove. These Jews were luckier than others. I'm going to try and move my cursor without moving the slide. So right here, you can see that there is a stovepipe, which means that they were luckier than many others who did not have stovepipes and lived in what were called black cottages, in which there was no way for the wood smoke that was produced in the wood burning oven to get out of the cottage, particularly in winter when you wanted the windows closed. And so a pall constantly was hanging in the air. And you can imagine that wasn't too good for respiratory health. Over here, next to the stovepipe, you can see a bed. So it was really one room. The wall is papered with newsprint in Yiddish and what looks like Polish here, actually. And it was a pretty difficult existence. A 19th century Yiddish children's song called Bulbus was used as one way to teach little kids the days of the week. The Yiddish word bulbus comes from the Lithuanian word bulvis, which means potatoes. And basically, the song is Sunday potatoes, Monday potatoes, Tuesday and Wednesday potatoes, Thursday and Friday potatoes. But on the Shabbos, on Saturday, there's something new. We have a potato kugel. And then on Sunday, it's potatoes again. So the diet was pretty lean and people lived a harsh life. By contrast, Jews who came from Germany and some of the other German-speaking lands generally were more assimilated. They weren't forced into specific areas of residence, and they were generally more affluent. I love this painting that's in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. It was done by a Polish Jewish artist named Yankel Adler, simply called Sabbath. And he actually studied under Paul Klee and was very influenced by a lot of the modernist movements of the time. And his work was, among other works of Jews, singled out to be shown in the degenerate art exhibition that was sponsored by the Nazis. And he fled first to Paris and then later moved to England, where he died in, I think, the late 1940s. If you compare this image of the Sabbath with the kitchen dwelling that I just showed you among the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, you can see that this Sabbath depiction is really about rest, which is what Sabbath is all about. They've had their meal. The challah is half eaten. She seems to be cracking some sunflower seeds, and it doesn't seem like a particularly stressful life. What united these two groups of Jews, if there was anything, was the idea of the holiness of the Sabbath. And no matter how poor Jews were, they scrimped and saved throughout the week so that they could welcome the Sabbath in a way that appropriately honored the day. And one of the most typical foods that was served on the Sabbath was challah. This was originally from the region of southern Germany and also around Alsace. And the name was berchus, which you can still find in some bakeries in that part of the world. And it meant braided. And as you know, challah is a braided loaf. When we think of it today in our American Jewish context, it is a very rich, enriched dough that has quite a bit of oil in it. It also has eggs, and most recipes have quite a bit of sugar, so it's really pretty sweet. But the original loaf was made simply with water. It was sourdough, and so it had a bit of a tang. After the potato was fully entrenched, often mashed potato was added to the dough, but it had a different flavor profile than it does now. The gefilte fish that I had asked you to look at the label. When I was putting together this talk and I was just noodling around on the internet, I was kind of curious to see if Manischewitz was still selling itself the way it once did. And I found that it has new labeling, which I found kind of silly, but also quite charming, because it's meant to be somehow a more consumer-friendly label. You do see the kosher here, which is pretty prominent, so that you know that you can have it at Passover, but it's a real catch since 1888, and you have this friendly fisherman. I also want to point out that it says liquid broth. Now, I don't know what school most of you are in. I think I'm sort of an anomaly these days because certainly when I have prepared foods for my students, many of them are a little bit put off by the natural gel that forms when you boil fish with its bones and the skin, and then you end up with the beautiful jelly when the fish cools. That to me is really the real joy of gefilte fish. But a lot of people, a lot of Americans apparently, I don't know, developed an aversion to it or decide they didn't like it. Maybe it was too fishy. And so in the 1960s, Manischewitz and other gefilte fish manufacturers patented a recipe for synthetic gel that could be used that really didn't have any flavor. The fact that this has liquid broth tells people that they don't have to worry about having the aspic. Now, of course, gefilte fish is kind of a misnomer if you're buying the balls in a Manischewitz jar. It means stuffed fish. And the original recipe was to take a whole carp and to take out the bones and to create a force meat with the fish flesh and then mix it with breadcrumbs and eggs and caramelized onions. You could put some herbs in, season it with salt and pepper, put it back in the fish, which was the stuffing of the fish, and then sew it up. And that was your beautiful gefilte fish. And this image I got from the Gefilteria website. Jeffrey Yoskowitz and Liz Alpern are the geniuses behind this company, and they participated in the YIVO course that I organized on Ashkenazi food. But they have a business that sells terrines of gefilte fish at Passover that you should really check out because it's quite good and closer to the original than Manischewitz. Another classic Sabbath dish is cholent. And the word, again, helps us understand where these foods originated. The word cholent comes from chaud and long, which means hot or warm and slow. And in Jewish villages and shtetls, people took their bread and they also took their stews to a communal oven. They didn't make these foods at home, and particularly for the Sabbath, when cooking was proscribed, they would take their own casserole. They would either cover this with a bread crust or the top of the casserole itself and put their own identifying mark on it, bring it to the village baker, and leave it in the oven where it would cook very slowly overnight and develop wonderful flavors. You have less tender cuts of beef that become very, very flavorful and soft when they cook so slowly. Cholent has beans in it, usually root vegetables like carrots, and also often some breadcrumbs. The Sephardic version of this is called adafina, which also comes from the same kind of roots in Arabic that have to do with heating. And so after the Sabbath morning services, people would go and fetch the cholent from the bakery and then bring it home and enjoy it. Here we have noodles. It's not clear exactly when noodles started being used among Jews in Eastern Europe. The first documentation of the farfalle, which are the bow tie noodles you see in the kasha varnishkas on the right, dates only to the mid-19th century, but most likely they came into use in the 16th century via Italy. And the kugel originally was simply made with leftover stale bread that was bound with egg. Again, onions were added to it and different kinds of herbs. It was very much a frugal kind of cooking because you never wanted the bread to go to waste, obviously. And so you would find ways, as even with the gefilte fish, you have the fish, but once you add breadcrumbs to it, that expands the amount of the fish filling that you have, and so you can feed many more people. So the kugel was really a frugal way to stretch food when you had a tight budget, and it was cooked alongside the cholent in these communal ovens. The kasha varnishkas are very much an Eastern European take on noodles, primarily because you see the kasha, which are the buckwheat groats. Buckwheat groats were favored because, like rye, they can grow under harsh conditions. and they're not as difficult. Buckwheat isn't actually a grain, it's a grass, and it's not as temperamental to grow as wheat, and therefore not as expensive. And kasha varnishkas arose from, if any of you have tasted Ukrainian vareniki, they're dumplings that are filled most commonly with farmer's cheese or sometimes with cherry filling. In the summertime, they're really wonderful. They could also be stuffed with kasha filling. And the root of that word, varitz, simply means to boil. So it's much easier to take the kasha and put it on the noodles, especially if they're decorative, with their little butterfly wings, than it is to laboriously make individual dumplings. And that is how kasha varnishkas arose. Dumplings are pretty much ubiquitous in almost every culture. There's something about stuffed pockets of dough that is just irresistible. The classic accompaniment to chicken soup is just plain noodles. But for special occasions, certainly if people could afford it for the Sabbath, they would go to the trouble of making dumplings, these kreplach, which they would fill with ground meat, ground beef. Sometimes ground liver, chicken liver would be added in, or calf's liver sometimes as well. And then they were folded into this triangular shape and gently boiled and then added to the chicken soup. You generally want to cook them separately so that in case one of them breaks open, you don't make the chicken soup cloudy. Knedlach are matzo balls, and they're related to the whole Central European repertoire of different kinds of dumplings that are not so much filled as just shaped and made either from breadcrumbs or bread or potatoes, and known in one form or another as knödel. So knedlach would be the Yiddish word. These are made with matzo balls, and we think of them as really, these are matzo balls. They're made with matzo meal, and we think of them as very, very traditional. But in fact, they likely are a type of dumpling that originated among American Jews when matzah meal began to be packaged for Passover. And then there was a recipe printed on the back of the package, and it was really easy just to add water or seltzer and an egg, and basically then you could put them together quickly. What would Jewish cooking be without gribbinus and schmaltz? Because Jews did not eat lard, which was prevalent in the countries and Ashkenazi Jews were living in, they needed a different source of fat. And of course, there was butter, but butter could not be mixed with meat. And so the skin of poultry was rendered. It was cooked very slowly until it melted. And then you got these crisp bits of leftover chicken skin called gribbinus, lightly salted, which are just really exquisite. The schmaltz that we're most familiar with in the United States is made from chicken skin. It's what's most readily available. But in the old country, people were more often using geese and also duck fat, which is even richer than the chicken. One of the hallmarks of Ashkenazi cuisine, as I have mentioned earlier, is its frugality. And the what you see on the right is chopped liver, chopped chicken liver, and it's something I am guessing that everyone on this call knows and has tasted, and I hope loves. It really came about because the liver of chickens contains a lot of blood. And in order for it to be kosher, all of that blood had to be removed so that it was fit to eat. And the only way to do that was to broil it, and dare I say, broil it to death. I know it was already done, but dead, but it had to be broiled so there was no trace of blood. And that rendered the chicken livers really, really dry and pretty much inedible. So, what do you have to do? You have to add fat back in. So, fat in the form of schmaltz, which truly makes the best chicken liver, caramelized onions that you have cooked in the schmaltz. Some people add chopped eggs, hard-boiled eggs to it, and some salt and some pepper, and then it's all very finely chopped using a hochmesser, which is like a mezzaluna that chops in a wooden bowl. I had my grandmother's beautiful wooden bowl that she used only for chopping chopped liver until one day it just cracked in half. Um, Chopped liver became so ubiquitous in the United States that it became this meme. And you see lots of gifs that people use sometimes saying, "What am I, chopped liver? Like, am I worthless?" And I never really understood the basis for that because I think it's quite exquisite. Sadly, one of the foods that comes from offal, OFFAL, the innards of chicken, that has fallen out of favor is helzel, which is really wonderful. It's the chopped, uh, I'm sorry, it's the skin of geese or chicken. Geese are a little better because the neck, it's really the neck is so much bigger. It's hard to work with a chicken. But you take all of the bones out and then you chop together onions and breadcrumbs and some egg and salt and pepper and again some herbs if you want them. And you stuff the skin neck, the skin of the neck, and then sew it up, poach it, and then you bake it until it's really crisp, as you see here. And I would be curious in the comments if any of you are still making it or if any of you have tasted it. It's really hard even to find chickens, not to mention geese, with their necks still attached. And another favorite food of mine that has fallen out of favor in Jewish communities here is pcha, which is calf's foot jelly. And again, you have this aspic, which is one of the things that I particularly love. In Russia, when I went to the Soviet Union for the first time, I was astonished to see this everywhere. It turns out it's a very, very standard dish still made today called cholodets, or sometimes it's called studin, both of which mean chilled. And more often than not, it's made with pork, although it can be made with beef as well. And so this is another dish that really is due for a comeback. It's served either with kren, which is horseradish, or with very strong mustard. So just a few other iconic Ashkenazi foods. I mentioned the half sours. What's important about Jewish style pickles, whether they be cucumbers or green tomatoes or classic sauerkraut, is that they're lacto fermented. I think in the United States, if you mention pickles, people automatically think of foods that have been pickled with vinegar. But lactofermentation involves simply a fairly weak brine of salt, say 3.5 to 5%. And you put the vegetable into the brine, and for half sours, you only have to leave it for about 3 days. You can add dill, you can add garlic, you can add peppercorns. I always add a horseradish or a black currant leaf to make sure that they stay crisp because those leaves have a lot of tannins. And then they have not only this wonderful tang, but they also have what we understand now as probiotics, really good beneficial bacteria that are good for the gut microbiome. If you want fully soured pickles, you leave them in for about 5 days. Then there's, again, another kind of pickling, the schmaltz herring. This herring is called schmaltz because it is caught just before the fish has spawned. So it's at its very fattiest moment. And then it is left in a fairly weak salt brine for about 24 hours just to firm up the fish. And then it is pickled in a regular vinegar brine with some sugar to make it sort of sweet and sour. And that's how you get pickled herring. And then you also have hrein, which comes from the Russian hrin, meaning horseradish. And it's particularly beautiful if you add beets to it and get this ruby color. So one of the great characteristics of some of Ashkenazi food is its sour, tangy taste. But I have to say that there is a great divide between the Litvak Jews, those who are from Lithuania and the northern part of the Pale of Settlement, and the Galicianer, those from Galicia, which is Poland and Ukraine, who love things sweet and add sugar to gefilte fish. They add sugar to pickles, sweet and sour cabbage rolls. And there's great disdain on the part of both groups for the other's way of preparing these things. The sweetness came into the South with the rise of the sugar beet industry in the late 19th century, and I'll get to that in a minute. So finally, we get to potatoes, and I left this for my last slide of classic Ashkenazi foods because the potato was not accepted in Russia in particular until the mid to late 19th century, which is kind of astonishing to think about because we so easily equate potatoes with Russian cuisine. But the Russian peasants were terrified of the potato when it was first introduced in the 18th century, because here was this tuber that grew underground and it had eyes, and so it must be the food of the devil. And they refused to plant it. They refused under Peter the Great, under Elizabeth I, under Catherine the Great. And there were potato riots and potato mutinies until around 1850. And then finally the government tried softer ways to encourage them to plant potatoes. And the potato became so firmly established that its Russian cuisine is unthinkable without it now. The word latka comes from oladya, which is the Russian word for pancake. And the pancakes that were made before were generally made from cheese. And once potatoes were accepted, then of course you got the beloved kugel in potato form. So for the second half of my talk, I want to discuss what happened when the Ashkenazi Jews arrived on American shores. And here you see this delightful print from the Library of Congress from the 1890s, showing the earlier Germanic Jews, still Ashkenazi, but they had been in the United States for, 40 to 50 years already before this massive immigration of Eastern European Jews arrived. You can see how well dressed they are in their bowler hats, and they're fancy. The women are wearing fancy hats, and their poor brethren, who look kind of downtrodden. The beards are not as neatly clipped as those of the German Jews, and their clothing betrays also a lack of stylishness. They really came with virtually nothing. One thing that distinguished the Jewish immigration from other immigrant groups, particularly Chinese laborers or Southern Italian laborers who came, is that the Jews came as families. So there were a lot of women and children as well, and not just workers. One of the only valuable things that many of these families were able to bring with them was the samovar, which was absolutely prized. And in the Philadelphia Jewish Museum, there's a beautiful example of a samovar that was brought by a family in the 1890s. And the samovar was used exclusively for brewing tea. And you don't actually brew the tea inside the samovar, which is what it looks like should happen. This is actually an empty cylinder with a chimney that goes, it's as though you can almost see the shadow of it going right up through the center of it. And into that chimney, you put either charcoal or pine needles or twigs or whatever you have that will burn, and you heat the water that's in the cylinder. You make a strong brew, a strong concoction of the tea, which you set on the top of the samovar, at the very top, in a little teapot. And then you turn the spigot and the hot water comes out into as much of the brewed tea as you want, so you can regulate how strong you want it. So these Jews from Eastern Europe arrived in the United States, and life wasn't as easy as perhaps they had hoped. And for many of them, it wasn't that much better. Here you see a Jewish family on the Lower East Side. It's true that instead of one room, they have more than one room, because you can see a bedroom behind a door off in the background. But it was still pretty much the kitchen used as an all-purpose room, particularly those who were involved in the garment industry, as my own grandmother was. This is how she started out. The German assimilated Jews wanted very much to try to help. And in 1889, they set up the Educational Alliance on the Lower East Side. So the Lower East Side was about a 1 square mile area into which 500,000 Eastern European Jews poured. So you can imagine how crowded it was, and a lot of the conditions were unhygienic. And the German Jews set up these cooking classes because they wanted to help young girls learn a trade, for one thing, but also to assimilate them and to get them to stop eating the foods that they considered so unhealthy. Not enough vegetables, not enough fruits. They didn't like that there was so much garlic. They didn't like that there was so much vinegar. And they really were trying to encourage them to eat a bland, and my own words would say tasteless, American diet. People then didn't necessarily understand the benefit of probiotics, but it's true that the diet of the Eastern European Jews wasn't perhaps as healthy as it could have been. Food became one of the great dividing issues between the two groups of Jews, the German ones who had already assimilated and the newly arrived European ones, Eastern European ones. And it came to a head in 1883 at what came to be known as the Trefa banquet in Cincinnati for the 10th anniversary of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and the first graduating class from the Hebrew Academy there. And as you can see, if you look through this menu, there are little neck clams, there are soft shell crabs, there's shrimp, there are frog's legs with cream, even not intrinsically treif foods, but ice cream and other forms of cream are served along with meat. And so it was just kind of appalling to many. The Hebrew Union College's president, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, insisted that dietary laws had lost their relevance, and he dismissed what he called kitchen Judaism. But the rift that this banquet caused was really profound, and it led to the founding of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York in 1887, which was conservative Judaism as opposed to Reform Judaism. It was at about this time that the first Jewish cookbooks started appearing in the United States. The first one was a kosher cookbook published in 1871 by Esther Levy. And it served a purpose for middle-class Jewish households. But then in 1889, a cookbook called Aunt Babette's Cookbook appeared, and it was not kosher. And she said, as long as you have the right spirit, it doesn't matter whether your kitchen is kept kosher. And that cookbook went through 11 editions. So life was already changing for a lot of the Jews who had moved to the United States. And by the early 20th century, cookbooks were becoming established. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Settlement Cookbook, which was actually first published in 1901 by the Settlement House, which was an organization in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, founded by German Jews to help assimilate Eastern European Jews and other immigrants. And this one went through, I have to check my notes. So yeah, 43 editions, and it's still being sold today, and it's been updated. But you can see from the first edition on the top, The Way to a Man's Heart. And it had Jewish recipes, but it also had some that weren't specifically Jewish, but from other immigrant groups. But from this one, the publication of community and charity cookbooks through congregations, particularly the sisterhoods in Jewish communities and at Jewish synagogues and temples, became a very important and standard way to raise money for the communities. So how did Jewish food come to be associated so closely with New York? Well, as I mentioned, the Lower East Side was just bursting with Jewish life. And many of these Jews found their fortunes eventually through selling food. And they started out with push carts. And here you can see a man selling kvass. So kvass is the very lightly alcoholic, it's like a small beer that is made by taking stale rye bread, allowing it to ferment, extracting the water from it, adding a little bit of honey, sometimes a little bit of yeast, and allowing that to ferment for a few days. And then you have this wonderful fizzy, sort of toasty tasting beverage that's actually quite healthful because, again, it has those probiotics. The usual trajectory was to go from a push cart like this to having a stable kiosk in front of a store. And this guy is selling pickles. And you can see the sign above. We carry a full line of Passover products. Leave your order. And because there were still very many push carts or horse and wagons, the order could be delivered immediately. And from this in place, not quite brick and mortar yet, but it did evolve into brick and mortar stores. And that's how Russ and Daughters began. They started out selling herring from barrels and then on a horse and a wagon that traveled through the streets. This was in 1907. And by 1914, they had established Russ and Daughters appetizing store. And then 100 years later, in 2014, they opened their cafe. And now the cafe has several branches. So Russ and Daughters was originally what was known as an appetizing store. Appetizing not as an adjective, but as a noun. Appetizing meaning fish and dairy and cold salads and all the kinds of things that were not meat could be sold in the appetizing stores. And they were best known for all different kinds of smoked fish. There was another genre of Jewish eatery that was very important in the early 20th century, and that was the dairy restaurant. And here you could go in and get a meal. There was all dairy foods and fish. It just didn't have meat. And so people who were practicing a kosher way of life didn't have to worry about the food being contaminated. And Ratner's was founded in 1905 and existed until 2007, I think. Let me see. No, 2004. And they were particularly famous for their blintzes, which are basically crepes from the Yiddish word blintz, from the Russian blin or blinchik, generally filled with farmer's cheese or, blueberries. And it was a really wonderful institution. But the most famous of all was the deli. And this was where people could get meat, particularly cured meats like pastrami and corned beef and different kinds of kosher sausages. And the deli in New York became a phenomenon. And very soon it came to be a kosher style deli, meaning that it was not strictly kosher. Something like the Carnegie Delicatessen, and there was usually a line in front of it. It was really famous, not just for its overstuffed sandwiches, as you see here, but also for its very surly waiters. So, it was sort of a shtick. And it lasted until 2016. I think there may still be a small kiosk now in Madison Square Garden, but basically the delicatessen, as we knew it on the Upper West Side, is gone. There's still Katz's on the Lower East Side. That feels a bit more like a tourist destination these days, but the spirit is still there. People were already rueing the loss of the deli as early as the early 2000s. And in 2009, David Sachs, a Canadian journalist, published a book called Save the Deli. And it was this cri de coeur, we're losing the deli and all the wonderfulness of this tradition as people stopped having, these heavy, fatty, salty foods. But as early as 2010, a new generation of delis started opening up throughout the United States, and I'm sure in other countries as well. And these had no, they didn't pretend to be kosher at all. But they drew on a spirit of playfulness and a spirit of Jewish tradition. So in America, you know, the Golden Land, you can eat challah every day. This is Wise Sons in San Francisco. And if you look at what I pulled out from the menu, pastrami and ground beef patty on griddled Jewish rye, so far so good, with Swiss cheese. So obviously it's not kosher. And then they play with Yiddish. Instead of the Big Mac, you have the Big Macher. And that one is served on a challah bun. Um, The deli is part of a larger story of the assimilation of Jewish foods into American life. And arguably, Crisco, which has, you know, in our present generation been anathematized, has been responsible for much of that assimilation. It came on the market in 1911. This is actually a recipe book from 1933 that was published in Yiddish and English. In a pamphlet that appeared in the story of in 1913 on the story of Crisco, Rabbi Moses Margolis said the Hebrew race has been waiting 4,000 years for Crisco. So Crisco is hydrogenated cottonseed oil, really not so good for you, but it was part of, you could have it with meat, you could have it with milk. It crossed both lines. And the important thing for American assimilation is that it was pure and it was white. And so this idea arose that kosher food was being held to a higher standard than, say, the mainstream foods by other corporations. And a lot of people got it in their minds that kosher food was better, even though Jews were still very much the other. The assimilation of Jewish food into mainstream American diet was accelerated in the 1960s by a brilliant ad campaign masterminded by William Birnbach for Levy's Rye Bread, a Brooklyn based company. And he said to them, you shouldn't be catering just to a Jewish clientele. You have to reach out and embrace other people. New York is a big city. So this campaign ran between 1961 and into the 1970s. And these images were plastered on subway cars. You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's real Jewish rye. And besides the Native American, the little black boy, there, you know, was a cowboy, there was a Chinese man, there was an Italian nonna, there was Buster Keaton. I mean, all kinds of wonderful different faces, and they all loved Levy's rye. I mean, the irony is that Levy's became the best-selling rye bread in the United States, but in the process, it became industrialized, and the really healthful, delicious rye bread that people were buying at bakeries started dying out because they couldn't compete with the Levy's. And I have to say, I don't know if any of you saw this morning's New York Times online about what's happening with bagels and how private equity has decided that bagels are the next best place to put their money, and they see a big future in it because they can use bagels to, you know, make all kinds of sandwiches, you know, bacon, egg, and cheese and everything else. And I'm really worried for another demise of the bagel after that. So closely identified was Jewish food with New York City that New York Magazine in 1968, its cover story was A Gentile's Guide to Jewish Food. One half of this underground gourmet column was the wonderful designer Milton Glaser. Another contribution to New York and national American Jewish life was candy and the candy trade. I certainly grew up with Barton's candies, especially on holidays. And here is what the candy store looked like on West 34th Street in the early 1950s. Their big rival was Baroncini, but that was also founded by Jewish immigrants. They had just two brothers. They changed their name to Baroncini so that they would sound Italian. Barton's was founded by an Austrian Jewish immigrant who came to this country. So closely tied were Jews with candy that you might be surprised to learn that some of our most beloved American candies, including Tootsie Rolls, Bazooka Bubble Gum, Peeps, Easter chocolates, lollipops, halva. I mean, there are all kinds. Were all invented by Jewish candy makers. And there's a reason for that. The sugar beet industry arose in Poland and Germany in the early 19th century, but really got established there in the late 19th century. And Jews were heavily involved both in the refining and in the distribution of it. And so sugar cane didn't have to be imported. The sugar beets were really easy to grow, cheap to refine, and suddenly sugar was inexpensive. And Jews in particular were eating so much sugar that in Germany, there was, I don't know if I can call it an epidemic, but there was widespread diabetes among the Jewish population, so much so that it was called Judenkrankheit, the Jewish disease. In Russia, there was a ditty, Chai Vysotskого, Sakhr Brodskого, Россия Trotskova, and it rhymes in Russian and sounds really good. But tea was under the aegis of the tea mogul Zalman Vysotsky. Sugar was in Odessa, Ukraine, overseen by Brodsky, Lazar Brodsky, who was known as the Sugar King. And obviously, Trotsky was highly associated with Russia. So the exchange went two ways. It wasn't just Jewish food going into mainstream America. Mainstream American foods entered into traditional Jewish cooking as well. The marvelous Mrs. Maisel's Coca-Cola brisket. Well, here you see my mother's perfect Jewish-style brisket. I don't know how old I was when I wrote this down, but it's shorthand for, a brisket, put it in the oven fat side up, 30 minutes per pound, cover it, and all you do is you mix together a bottle of Heinz chili sauce, a Coca-Cola, and a package of Lipton's dry onion soup mix. And I have to say, it has that sweet, sour Galicianer taste, and it's really delicious. My mother also used commercial ginger snaps for her sweet and sour cabbage rolls. And she used Welch's grape jelly to make her sweet and sour meatballs. I think she might not have been aware that John Welch was a founder of the John Birch Society, which was pretty anti-Semitic. But the other food, American food, that really changed things was Philadelphia cream cheese. So cream cheese in the old country didn't really exist as such. It was farmer's cheese, which we can still find, from Breakstone or other countries, other companies. Farmer's cheese is crumblier. It's a lot more dry. And the Breakstone brothers were Jewish immigrants from Lithuania who came in the late 1800s, the 1890s. And they started making a very high-fat cream cheese, a high-fat farmer's cheese that became known as cream cheese because it was so creamy. It didn't have the crumbly texture. And they called it Philadelphia cream cheese because Philadelphia was known as the city where the best dairy products were made. Philadelphia cream cheese was bought by Kraft in 1928. And it was then that it most likely started being smeared on bagels. And here you see that holy trinity of Jewish foods again, the bagel, the cream cheese, and the lox. And it's pretty interesting to contemplate because in the old country, bagels were served plain. They were small, they were dense, and they were a food unto themselves. Here, they are paired not just with the cream cheese, but with a fish that looks, because it's red, akin to meat. And it's mixed with cheese. So there was in this combination something that felt maybe ever so slightly illicit in the combination. Of course, most people, when they're eating, bagels with lox and cream cheese, are actually eating bagels with Nova salmon and cream cheese, not realizing that's not actually lox. Lox is heavily salted and not to contemporary taste for most people. Nova salmon has been salted, but then it's cold smoked and it's a little gentler. The other thing that Philadelphia cream cheese did was create a new kind of very, very tender dough for pastry. In the old country, rugelach were made. The name comes from ragalik, which means little horn or crescent in Russian. Rugelach is a Yiddish word. And they were a yeasted dough, like would be used in cinnamon buns. With the Philadelphia cream cheese, it became much more pastry-like. And the first recipe for rugelach using this kind of dough was published in 1950 in Mildred Knopf. She was married to Alfred A. Knopf in her cookbook, Cook My Darling Daughter. So we're getting to the end here. Bagels. One of the great sadnesses, I think, in the story of Ashkenazi Jewish food. So as I mentioned, bagels were dense. They were about 3 ounces. They were crisp on the outside, crusty, I should say, on the outside. They were hand rolled. They were boiled, and they were delicious. Well, Harry Lender, a Jewish immigrant from Poland, installed the first automatic bagel maker equipment, bagel making equipment in his New Haven shop in 1963. And honestly, it went downhill from there because the bagels were not hand rolled. He decided to package them and to sell them frozen, which meant that to make them softer and not quite so hard, they tended to be steamed instead of boiled. They were often pre-sliced, so you could take them out of the freezer, just pop them into the toaster, and what could be more American and convenient than that? And then all of these other flavors started being introduced. But if you look at the packaging, you can see that Bagel Shop Bagels, the gold standard was still New York, because here's Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, and everything. But bagels, were sort of destroyed by the bagel cafes that started popping up. The early ones had names that at least reflected the Jewish background or the New York connection. So it was Noah's Bagels or Einstein or Manhattan Bagel. But now if you go to a mall, you see the Great American Bagel. And what really happened is they realized that they weren't making that much money just selling bagels at breakfast, and they wanted them for a lunch treat to make sandwiches with. And so bagels ended up being a vehicle for something else and not really a food in themselves. And this led to such American aberrations as gigantic bagels from O Bagel in Hoboken, which have pastrami and cheese, or the opposite, bagel bites with cheese and pepperoni, which are pizza snacks. And I mean, there's something absolutely wonderful about the Americanization of things, if you want to look at it that way. But it's also kind of horrifying. Pepperoni made with pork and chicken added, and tomato sauce and cheese. So latkes also endured some difficult treatment. In the 1990s, there was, a real fat phobia. And so the idea was that you could still have your latkes without the oil that actually made them symbolic for Hanukkah. And these fat-free latkes are a modern miracle in and of themselves. And I might add that they're probably very dry. And I will end with this image. So no matter what has happened to Ashkenazi food in its journey from Europe to the United States, it's still quite recognizable. And Jews' ability to adapt and transform foods is really what it's all about. The symbolism is so important, even if the foods themselves have morphed in different ways from time to time. And what could be more symbolic than the Jewish mother and more appealing and drawing you to it? And the idea of the chicken soup, the Jewish penicillin that will cure all ills. In 1993, Jack Canfield first published his Chicken Soup for the Soul self-help books. And since that time, he has sold over 500 million copies, and there are over 300 titles, including Chicken Soup for the Christian Soul, Chicken Soup for the Latter-day Saint Soul. And now you can also feed your dog Chicken Soup for the Soul branded food. So on that note, I am going to end my lecture, but I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much for this wonderful trip down, Jewish food lane. So many people have said so many wonderful things in the chat about how hungry this makes them and about memories and nostalgia that this brings up, and people have shared some wonderful personal stories. So many questions. We'll just take a few. One big one for me is, can you talk a little bit about the Jewishness of Jewish food? It kind of comes up with all these different foods in different ways, but I wonder if you could kind of like bring it together for us. Some of the foods are connected to holiday traditions and other kind of, observances. But for many foods, you talked about, the connection with co-territorial foods, with the names coming from Russian or from Polish or Lithuanian or from German. So, what makes these foods distinctively Jewish, or how do you tease them out from the co-territorial foods?
Yeah, that is the big question, Alex, and it's one I wrestle with continually. I think that if you're talking about, in a very strict and narrow sense, what makes a food Jewish, it's the food that is used for ritual purposes, for holidays, and that are connected to certain important moments in religious Jewish life. That being said, that is a very narrow way to look at it, because there are many Jews who eat Jewish without actively practicing as religious Jews. And there are certain foods that serve as touchstones. And these are some of the ones that I've mentioned today. But I think that if we're talking about Jewish food writ large, it's really a pretty amazing and wonderful story of Jews in the diaspora throughout the world, having been forced under great duress from their homelands and finding ways to adapt to new cultures, to introduce new foods so that they can make foods that are quite similar in certain ways to what they knew, and to continue to share them with their families. I was just in the Canary Islands, and I was blown away to discover that ropa vieja, which is a classic Cuban dish, it's a shredded beef with tomatoes. It's a stew, is a Canary Island dish. It was brought to Cuba in the 19th century, but it was brought to the Canary Islands by Jews who fled the Inquisition, and it dates back to their Sabbath stews. So I think you can find a lot of traces throughout the world if you start digging.
Fascinating. Never would have thought that, that Cholent offshoot there. So there's a ton of questions in the Q&A. We'll just maybe kind of try to briefly touch on a few of them. You spoke about Galicianers and Litvoks. Do you have anything else to add about that division, that's famous food division?
Oh, I don't want to get into quarrels here. It's interesting because I grew up in the sweet and sour camp. And as I've grown older, I'm much more in the savory camp. And I don't like to add as much sweetness to my foods. But I think it's an historical divide and maybe just a familiar tradition divide, but it really just tells where the easiest access to sugar was, and where it was least expensive is what initiated it.
That makes great sense. We have another question about this, about the cholent, the communal ovens that the cholent was baked in. Do we know anything about that as a social institution? Did people pay a subscription fee, or how did that work?
It was different in different places. I don't know about subscriptions, but you obviously had to pay the baker because he was the one who was expending a lot of money on the fuel, and also having to, when it was bread baking, he actually had to watch it to make sure it didn't burn. The stews were a different thing. So it was very much part of the fabric of any Jewish, and not just Jewish, also Christian communities had communal bakeries as well, because it was so expensive to bake things at home. And also there was a danger of fire in many shtetls. A lot of the houses were of wood, and so you didn't want to risk fire in individual dwellings, and it was better to have it contained in one place.
So these communal ovens it wasn't just cholent. People would go there to bake their own bread and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and people would have identifying marks that they could put into the dough, and hope that they were still visible, when they came to pick up their tray.
Okay, that's fascinating. So when you're talking about the immigration to America, you were talking about this earlier, the mass immigration period, but we have one of our viewers is asking about, the post-war, or like the immediate Holocaust generation and post-war immigrants. Is there a distinctive food story there, or is it immigrants just kind of joining the dominant culture that you already described?
Yeah, it's very poignant. I think just in general terms, it's immigrants joining the culture that I've already described. But over the past few decades, some beautiful books and manuscript books have been published about the foods that the recipes that women were writing down in the concentration camps to preserve the Jewish traditions. And if you go to the Jewish Food Society website, you'll find some of them there. And also In Memory's Kitchen is a wonderful volume that has collected these recipes. So I think those foods were transmitted more through family stories and family practice than entering into the American mainstream.
Speaking of cookbooks, there's an interesting question here about the history of cookbooks and in Eastern Europe, and to what extent these traditions were codified, where and when. And I would just want to editorialize and add that, there was the Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook, this wonderful cookbook by Fanny Lavando in Vilna, which YIVO published a translation of. And so if you're curious about that, you can, that particular cookbook, check that out on our online store. But yeah, is there anything you could tell us about the history of Jewish cookbooks? Auf ein Fuß.
Yeah. Well, much of the tradition was oral, and people passed it down orally. It was quite expensive to publish something. There are some cookbooks that were published in Yiddish, but that's particularly like in Lithuania, that had a really big and very well educated population. There are at least a couple that were published in Germany. I know of some in Hungary, and there is a book whose name is escaping me now, but that came out a few years ago about Hungarian Jewish manuscript cookbook. Barbara Kirschen-Black Gimblett has written quite a bit about the cookbooks of
Yes.
Eastern and Central Europe, so you should look for her work.
Wonderful. So there's so many questions. Maybe we'll just pick one or two more. Here's a good one. So when you're talking about the spice profile of Eastern European Jewish cuisine, other than pepper and garlic, what are the spices that characterize this cuisine?
Of the sweet spices, I would say cinnamon is way up there. You often find caraway. Caraway put not just into rye bread, where I personally don't like it in rye bread. I just like the pure taste of rye, but it's added a lot into soups and stews, and there I find it quite wonderful. You have fresh herbs, and here I'm thinking not just of parsley and celery, but also, again, it's hard to find in American grocery stores, celery root and parsley root, which make the best chicken soup. And they're really, well, celery root you can find. I can't really find parsley root unless we grow it ourselves. So I would say those are allspice you'll find, and cloves.
Perhaps this can be our final question. But could Megan Kerr asks, can you speak about the place of women in the world of Jewish food? Many of the pictures and artworks you showed today position women as the cooks, but on the other hand, it seems that men were doing the enterprising and that side of things. Could you speak about the gender divide for Jewish food?
Yeah, I feel like women were doing everything. Sorry, that's my little bit of editorializing, but it was a really hard life. They were the keepers of the home and the hearth, but they also were often the shopkeepers and the ones who are having to bring in a lot of the money, especially when if the husband had died or left the family or was killed or whatever had happened. I would say that women, the first cookbooks were written, Jewish cookbooks were written by women. But when we start getting into restaurants and delis and the more commercial aspects, more public facing aspects of Jewish food, then men were often more visible. Women didn't have to be hidden, but they were, really busy taking care of the family, or else they were doing the baking or making the homemade noodles or making some of the things that were served. The big names that you see in Jewish restaurants now, for the most part, tend to be male. And yes, I just saw that chat comment that came up. How could I have forgotten dill, my favorite herb? Dill is absolutely in there for Jewish flavoring. So thank you,
Yes,
whoever said that.
dill is huge. And on that note,
Yeah.
we can end on dill. Darra, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It's been wonderful to have you here.
Well, thank you all for sharing in it.